Well, we are very excited to kick off our panel on climate policy and initiatives. And joining me on the panel is Dr. David Alexander, Senior Science Advisor for Resilience Science and Technology Directorate and U.S. Department of Homeland Security.
Again, thank you for inviting us to participate in this webinar today. I am pleased to share some insights on the overall strategy as well as where S&T is mobilizing research and development to support the agenda. If you're not familiar with DHS, we did recently issue a strategic framework and action plan for addressing climate change. Those came out at the end of 2021. They are available on the website, so I encourage you to go take a look if you haven't. There's a lot of rich information, and it provides much more than I would be able to share with you today. It is looking to address how we can lead resilience and adaptation in climate change by better understanding the changes in the climate risk landscape resulting from a variety of strategic drivers. It's important for me to enumerate those here just to give that larger context that we are really looking at climate change from the lens of safety and security through that framework. One is that clearly we're seeing that climate change is contributing as well as informing new modes of strategic competition, particularly mostly acute in the Arctic area. We also see that global risks are changing and transforming in response to climate change. Clearly, there are demographic trends that have significant implications and consequences. We have aging infrastructure, and then there's an emerging technology that can offer potential solutions, as well as introduce new risks that we need to understand. So in many ways, the DHS strategy or the Homeland Security climate resilience strategy that was posted by the department really focused the enterprise into 5 key areas, with equity being an important tenet. And I emphasize equity because the Homeland Security enterprise is really more than just DHS itself. It really involves key stakeholders like infrastructure operators, as well as our state and local communities and stakeholders. And we want to ensure that when we're driving outcomes for climate resilience, we're not leaving any community behind. We're also trying to address and ensure that there is equitable advancement in climate resilience across that enterprise. The 5 key areas to kind of summarize the strategy really looks at how we can better provision climate information to improve climate literacy and the understanding of risks to promote more effective decision-making. Regulatory efforts such as building codes and revising things like the federal flood standard so that we can be a catalyst and incent and drive motivations in climate resilience. Third is resilience of internal DHS operations. If we're asking others to take action, we also need to take action, and we need to understand how we can take action. And these may include and are involving how can DHS transition away from fossil fuels, and at the same time, how can we limit our impacts or our contributions to climate change. The last focus area really is of our strategy is looking at incentives for economic innovation, carbon markets, parametric insurance, and co-investment, as well as technology innovation. And when we think of technology innovation, we're really thinking more broadly. It's not just limited to information technology. There are other solution spaces out there that we can leverage and motivate to address some of our key challenges around climate change.
Well, thank you very much, David, for giving us that outline. Again, a lot of this material is available on DHS's website. I want to go back to really the core overarching umbrella around safety and security. And you mentioned the Arctic zone. And for those that are less familiar, if you could just kind of go into a little bit more of depth around what does that mean, as well as even what's happening in the South Seas, South Pacific Seas, and how does all of this contribute to potential conflict? And of course, I'm going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine in just a few minutes as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and maybe I'll broaden the question a little bit. So what we're really trying to understand, but from a security community, and that's national security. So it's not just public safety, it's also the larger security fabric, is really what are the implications and long-term effects and challenges with climate change. Clearly, what we start to understand is that there are those strategic drivers I mentioned up front, as well as there are hotspots of climate impacts. Hotspots, clearly the Arctic is an area of, there's a hotspot area where the effects of climate change are very acute and in many ways better understood. And then there are hotspots around extreme events as a consequences of changes in the climate. And you can see that in terms of, where we're seeing a proliferation of wildfires, as well as an intensification of tropical storms. In the Arctic, it's probably also demonstrating where those strategic drivers clearly come together and intersect. So as you see the melting of sea ice, you're seeing now that new waterways are opening up for new commerce. We're seeing that there's potentially new territories that are opening up for exploration, and that is in many ways causing a strategic competition between international players. So it's not only do we need to curb the impacts of climate change and we need to start to reduce our contributions, but we need to address those larger context and those larger consequences of climate change in terms of where we are now in a new competing global environment that may involve tapping into new resources or may bring competing powers into closer proximity, which can create confrontation.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those waters in the Arctic zone isn't necessarily specified for certain sovereignties, correct? So it's somewhat of a first come first basis, and whoever starts to explore and takes advantage of those assets, correct?
That's correct. So when you look at global networks or initiatives around freedom of the seas, those were based on recognition of clear international boundaries, economic zones, and other factors. And when you observe the melting of ice and the opening of waterways, that can create new confrontation.
Yeah. Now, coming back to more kind of the domestic view, is that I think for some listeners or viewers, they're not maybe aware of something very basic, which is that when there's wildfires or hurricanes or tornadoes, it's not only affecting the civilians, it's also affecting the bases, the military bases and the assets that are deployed throughout the US as well as abroad. And when those are hit, those places where people live and people store the military assets, that has an impact in terms of our ability for readiness and conflict, right?
Yeah, so that's why we say it's really an intersection between safety and security. Not only do we have stresses and new scenarios that are facing our public safety entities and organizations, but now they're more tightly coupled and intersecting with our national security, our defense apparatus. Many of our facilities are codependent. So not only are they is their workforce housed within the civil areas of the communities, but also they may be sharing critical resources and key assets between and amongst them. And so we need to ensure the overall resilience of those elements.
Now, one of the challenges that DHS has is the organization also oversees this FEMA, and FEMA, of course, addresses any type of natural disasters. And we've seen so many wildfires, not just in California, but going all the way to Seattle, Washington. Now it's starting to go, creep into the middle of America as well. Where are things with resources, and does FEMA have the manpower and the resources and the technology to be able to handle all these things that's happening concurrently?
Yeah, that's a very complex question, and I would say that historically, and I think appropriately, the U.S. isn't unique in that we recognize that crises management really is a whole of society issue. So you are going to leverage different elements of society and key functions to support that. And that may come through things like national mutual aid compacts, or it may come from enhanced or increases in federal programs and resources. One of the key things that I think you're witnessing over the last couple of years is not just a recognition that there are cascading and compound effects, and there are interdependencies between strategic drivers like climate change and international competition around technology innovation. But what you're also seeing is that we really need to have a significant focus on pre-disaster risk reduction. And then recognize that we are going to have disruptions, and we need to be better prepared to cope and address those disruptions, which means we need to optimize functional recovery. And if you go and look at actions that the administration has taken, as well as Congress, you see that they've looked to improve resourcing in those two areas through increases in funding for grant programs. But they've also recognized that the U.S. Advances in significant ways when we invest appropriately in innovation and research and development. So they've complemented those investments in grants and programs to address pre-disaster risk reduction and increase functional recovery with complementary investments in research and development across the federal enterprise.
Yeah, I think just recently there was some article that came out about the fact that some of the full warning around flooding and severe hurricanes, for example, were not as timely as it needed to be to help people prepare, really. And then the other aspect is, if you look at examples of Haiti, the fact that their power system is centralized means that when the system goes down, the whole nation goes down. So the ability to have that decentralization, the ability to have that recovery, is a lot around infrastructure, right? And I wonder what type of investments are being made around infrastructure, from energy to other basic things like roads and housing, and even the ability to renovate and construct.
Yeah. So I think some of that will go beyond my ability to comment. I'm speaking more on the behalf of the innovation and science and technology community. There are significant investments being made there in terms of new legislation, as well as a transformation of existing operational programs across the federal government. But in the context of research and development, I think what you're saying is that DHS isn't unique in recognizing areas that it wants to pivot and emphasize to try and address not just climate change, but the interrelationship between climate change and some of these more systemic issues like aging infrastructure and extreme events. And so we have identified some initial thrust areas. I'll comment on those quickly, but then I would like to also share some opportunities with the community to demonstrate how we're acting on our identification of these focus areas. So there are a couple focus areas. I won't put these in any order of preference, but we are looking at disaster resilience of the future with a focus on utilities and public infrastructure. As I said, DHS typically will not act alone. We will be doing a lot with the interagency as we act on these focus areas. And when we look at resilience of the future for utilities and infrastructure, we're not just talking about developing new concepts and standards and methods, but we're also looking at how can we do more strategic foresighting and risk assessment, and at the same time recognize that those instruments need to rely on trusted foundational information that can't be static information. Events are and changes accelerating, so we need more persistent monitoring and observation capabilities and diagnostics, and those then need to translate into more alerting capabilities so that we can provision the appropriate protective measures and responses to those changing conditions. The second area is that we're looking to strengthen community resilience really emphasizing better understanding and advancing social and environmental equity. This gets into, we think there's some new advances and new learnings that need to take shape around understanding the confluence between impacts, vulnerability, and risk. Some people conflate these concepts, and they're really complementary concepts. And if we really want to understand vulnerability, we also need to understand and better understand the social and environmental equity constructs behind those terms. And those will involve new sources of information, as well as they may involve a new social and economic behavioral research. And then advanced materials and artificial intelligence. Clearly, this is a sweet spot of emerging technologies of the future. This starts to look at new advances in self-healing and regenerative materials and how those can be infused into our infrastructure to make it more transformative. And then how can new incentives from the markets like parametric insurance, as well as financial preparedness, can spark co-investment or adoption of those types of solutions. And then enabling new sensors for climate adaptation optimization. Clearly, you mentioned, if you want people to act, they need to know what to act against. If you want to reduce risk and increase life safety protections, we know that we need to continue to advance and enhance our alert, warning, and notification systems, and in some ways expand into areas that we typically have not been involved in. There are some foundational systems out there. You have the National Stream Gauging Network. You have a fairly robust national weather forecasting and warning capability run by the National Weather Service. But there are other areas where we need to expand the networks to improve the alert and warning capabilities as we are seeing events emerge and start to occur in areas that they traditionally did not. We're looking at technologies for reducing the impacts or our contributions to climate change. And this is really centered around executive actions as well as key efforts in terms of how do we reduce our emissions. These are key contributions that we make to climate change. And then how do we lower our dependency on fossil fuels? And this gets into areas where we're looking at new technologies for energy production, new power solutions around backup storage, charging, and generation, as well as we're looking at how can we transform key missions that Homeland Security is involved in, such as when we're talking about functional recovery. How do we make activities like debris removal more climate friendly? It's not only reduce the amount of debris, but how do we manage the amount of debris so that we can get the community back up and running? And then how do we address the challenges around if you're using alternative power or you're using new regulatory functions like power preemptive regulatory controls. This is where the example is California will do targeted power shutdowns to lower wildfire risk in hot zones. How do you ensure that critical facilities have backup power, and that backup power is not continuing to be reliant on old diesel power generators? So there are key areas of opportunities there that are beyond traditional information technology sectors, but clearly have a nexus to a Homeland Security mission space.
Well, we certainly appreciate you sharing kind of the breadth of some of these opportunities, and it's a lot. It's ambitious as well, ranging from, let's say, bacterial-based things that's within concrete substrates, so it could be self-healing, to sensors and IoT that can have predictability and real-time data for a digital twin, to the ability to synchronize with satellites so that you can actually have predictive modeling for potential wildfires and other things. So there's a lot there, as well as just reducing the emissions with the different types of machineries and assets that you guys use. Now, one of the things that we heard from Professor Barron's keynote earlier was this notion that climate change leads to conflict. And we saw this one chart where clearly they're all interdependent, but yet it was very much pointing to this a fact that when you have issues, scarcity, and disasters, undoubtedly you're going to have people fighting over resources and territory. You're going to have people migrating. We've seen that from South America, Central America to the US, and we're seeing that in the Middle East, and we're now starting to see that in Russia and Ukraine. How is climate change affecting security threat? And I recognize that Russia and Ukraine has a lot of more cultural, historic, and complex background, but what's the implication? And then for us, I think the other aspect we didn't quite talk about is energy independence. And I think EU is really feeling that, in particular from Russia with natural gas and oil. If you could just comment on some of these aspects.
Yeah, so I think on the aspect of scarcity, yes, absolutely. Climate change is a multiplier. It is a multiplier against a lot of strategic drivers as well as known impacts or consequences. More extreme weather, more disaster losses, more effect on the food and supply chain. One of the other aspects, though, of scarcity and climate change that still is a challenge is measuring and managing uncertainty. If you don't, a lot of the scarcity issues and conflict issues are exacerbated by the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the way and what things will be. And also, we still need to enhance and improve in terms of that area of communication as well as risk assessment and understanding. In terms of technologies and so forth, yes, clearly we've identified and we're no more unique than I think our peer international partners, is that we need more energy dependence. We need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. And there are a series of actions that we need to take and investments that need to be made. I mentioned some of those areas a few minutes ago, so I don't want to continue to add time and just repeat myself. But it's not just the ability to produce power and generate power. We have to recognize that we have to be able to store as well as distribute that power. So if you're wanting to transition into new alternative vehicles, do you have the technologies to support the charging needs that are necessary to support the different mission spaces where we rely on traditional fossil fuel-based vehicles?
Now, any comments on the Russia-Ukraine war and the potential implications to the U.S. from a DHS perspective?
Yeah, we continue to monitor changes in the global environment. There's a variety of threat vectors and disruptions and extremism factors that go into our analysis. So I can't really comment beyond that. But the fact is that, clearly our mission extends beyond just addressing terrorism and potential threats. It also, we have a strong law enforcement border protection component. And so there are implications as we see major disruptions occurring around the globe in terms of its impact on our immigration, and refugee support missions.
Mm-hmm. And one final question is, how are you working with some of the other agencies? I know within the last week or two, there's been a group of intentional, I think, academics, hackers that have easily hacked into national assets and infrastructure, including utilities and so forth. So with issues like Russia and Ukraine, we're starting to see a spike, even more so than the usual. How are we protecting our most important assets at home?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's an issue that's really not unique to climate change, right? So we continue to see an escalation as well as an expansion, acceleration in cybersecurity threats across a variety of vectors. if you go look at a series of investments that were made through the infrastructure bill, you will notice that DHS Science and Technology did receive funding and to look at cyber security and resilience. And some of the areas allows us to apply research and development to not just get ahead of those threat vectors, but start to work and co-invest with our interagency partners on catalyzing solutions that can increase our capability and our capacity to cope as well as address that emerging risk.
Well, I want to thank David for a terrific conversation on climate policy and initiatives within US DHS and FEMA. Please give him a round of applause and continue the discussion on climate change. We're excited to transition to our next panel on climate solutions.